Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, young leaders. Are you ready to jump into today's headlines? Do you want to up your media interview game? Well, you're in the right place. As an advocate and young leader, media can be a very powerful platform to convey your message and advance your advocacy. Welcome to 10 Steps to Media Success. Next slide, please. Today, we will lead you in an interactive training that will take you from media unsure to Hello-Amanpour. Today's session is being recorded so we can share with young leaders who are unable to join today. If you have any tech issues during this webinar, please type the word tech in the chat box. And let's start with a quick round of introductions. My name is Sumit Galhotra. I am the Senior Communications Associate for Youth Engagement at Women Deliver. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a brown-skinned man with light stubble, jet black hair, greenish eyes, and I'm wearing a white dress shirt with blue check marks. I am facilitating today's session from land comprising what is now Jersey City, which has been inhabited by the Lenape indigenous people in the past. I have previously reported for CNN International, the Huffington Post, the Jewish Daily Forward, among other outlets. I have also been on the other end of the seat doing frequent interviews with media as a senior Asia researcher for the Committee to Protect Journalists. Here at Women Deliver, among other things, I work to elevate young leaders' profiles and expertise through various channels, including media.
Hi everyone, my name is Olivia Ades-Lawlor and I'm an associate on the youth engagement team at Women Deliver. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman with dark brown hair and green eyes. I am currently wearing a black sweater and yellow pants, even though you can't see them. I'm co-facilitating this session from the land that is currently known as Brooklyn, New York, but formerly of the Lenape people. At Women Deliver, I manage the Speakers Bureau program and provide speaker preparation to young leaders to amplify and elevate their voices at speaking events. I support workshops. I also lead internal communications for young leaders via the Download, Mighty Networks, and info at WD Young Leaders. So I'm sure I've emailed many of you all before. SRHR has been the cornerstone of my professional, academic, and personal life, and I am humbled I've gotten to learn so much from the young leaders and alumni over my 2 years at Women Deliver. Really looking forward to today's training.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be with all of you virtually today. My name is Belinda Chu, and I am a senior associate on the youth engagement team at Women Deliver. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am an Asian woman with dark brown hair and dark brown eyes, wearing a black shirt and a striped cardigan. I am providing production support for this session from the land that is currently known as Queens, New York, but formerly of the Lenape people. At Women Deliver, I work on digital university and monitoring, evaluation, and learning to strengthen the young leaders' user experience and enhance program impact.
Thank you, everyone, for those lovely introductions. Just one more before we begin. My name is Nina Rembert. I'm an associate for the youth engagement team at Women Deliver, and I primarily work on multi-country workshops and alumni engagement. My pronouns are she, her. I am a Black woman with curly black hair and dark brown eyes, and I'm currently wearing a red sweater. I'm supporting today's session from the land currently known as Brooklyn, New York, previously of the Lenape indigenous people. I'm really happy to be here today and excited to get started with this media training. So without further ado, let's get started.
Awesome. So now that you've had a chance to meet some people on the Women Deliver side, we're going to start with some polling questions to get a sense of where your knowledge of this subject is now. And then we will also share these questions at the very end to see how you all learned. Now, don't worry, there's no pressure to get any of these answers right. This is really just our way to measure knowledge growth for this training. And for those of you joining by phone, unfortunately, you will not be able to complete polling throughout this webinar, and we apologize for this technical issue. All right, so take a few minutes to complete the answers that you see, the questions that you see on your screen, and I will give you a 30-second warning.
Could I see something?
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Raj from Romania. I just wanted to say that I'm currently on my phone and I can go through the polls with no difficulty. So it also works.
Oh, great.
For
Okay.
those of you that are in info, yeah.
Thanks so much for letting us know. All right, I see 3 people have completed it. I'll give you all a few more minutes. All right, so take about 30 more seconds and then we're going to move on. All right, I think we can now close the pre-assessment questions. Thank you so much. And we're going to do one more quick poll to get us all warmed up. So to get a sense of who's joining today's webinar, take a minute or two to select what region you are calling in from so we can see who's in the house. All right, just taking another couple seconds. Wow, it's great. We have every single region represented. That is incredible. Thank you all so much. And Sumit, over to you for the agenda.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. So in terms of what will be happening today, we will essentially, today's training is divided into 3 main parts. The first part will walk you through what you must do to prepare before an interview. The second will be about how to handle the interview itself. And then the third part will be some tips about how you can set yourself up for success after a media interview. After that, we will have Olivia take the hot seat as I interview her in a mock interview. Then we will have some amazing young leaders share their expertise as flash presenters. Finally, we will leave some time for questions and discussion. If you have questions at the end of the session, please type your question into the chat box, and we would be happy to create that space at the end for some discussion. So here's another quick poll to kick us off. Have you done a media interview before? Should be showing up shortly. There we go. So just take a minute or two to make your selection on the poll screen. Okay, well, it seems like we have a majority that has some experience in doing a media interview before, but also a sizable number that do not, and that's absolutely okay. And that's why we're having this media training today, is to get us all to be able to walk away with some tips today. So looking forward to sharing.
Great. So let's dive into our training. So we're going to start off with some tips on how to handle media requests that come your way and preparing for a potential interview. All right, so tip number 1, you snooze, you lose. We know that many of you are already skilled at gaining media attention for yourself, but at times, Women Deliver may also share media opportunities that come through our network. When we receive an opportunity, whether it's for Speakers Bureau to speak at an event or a workshop, or another opportunity, it's important to respond quickly. We would hate for you to miss out on a great opportunity because you were not able to answer in time. And this is even more important when it comes to media requests because journalists are often on tight deadlines and sometimes only have a few hours and maybe just a few days to publish a story, especially when it comes to breaking news events. We also appreciate you keeping in mind that the opportunity is coming from Women Deliver, and we work hard to foster these relationships and networks, so a timely response is always appreciated. That being said, it's also important that you all have the information you need to make an informed decision. If a journalist hasn't shared their deadline or enough information, you should feel free to ask for it. That way you can gauge if you have the time, interest, and availability to take this on and vet the journalist in advance. Remember, even if you don't have availability, you want to keep things on courteous and professional terms with journalists. Politely and promptly declining a media interview and expressing interest for future opportunities on a given topic can show the journalist you respect their time and they can consider you for future opportunities. Also, if you're able to decline the request in a timely manner, they'll have an opportunity to engage someone else who may be able to participate. Next slide.
Great, thank you, Olivia. Pro tip number 2, do your homework. When you receive a media request from a journalist, vet the request. Perform a quick Google search or scan Twitter to check if the journalist has a record of credible and reputable reporting. In this era of misinformation and propaganda, you want to be careful who you speak to, especially since some journalists can work in service of the opposition. Check to see what the journalist has reported on. Is their reporting credible, fact-based, and ethical? Is the outlet that they report for independent and trustworthy? You will also want to ask yourself if the media request will in some way advance your advocacy, and weigh that against any security risks, noting that visibility on sexual and reproductive rights, gender equality, human rights, abortion rights, contraception, HIV/AIDS, LGBTQI rights, among other topics, can be deemed sensitive in some countries, and state and non-state actors may find promotion of these issues as hostile. Better understanding what the journalist's story or report is about will help you better adapt your message and focus. Back to you, Olivia.
Thanks, Sumit. Pro tip number 3, define yourself. In the Digital University recorded webinar on speaker prep, you learn the importance of self-identification. When delivering a remark at a speaking engagement or giving a media interview, it's important to clearly convey who you are. We know many of you wear many hats and that Women Deliver is just one of the hats that you wear. And please know that with any media opportunity, our priority is you. We want you to shine. A media opportunity is about your advocacy. You should never feel pressured to make this about Women Deliver. And if it's not helpful to your advocacy or profile, you should feel comfortable declining any media opportunity we send your way. You are the best judge for what is helpful for your own work. But should you be interested in a media interview and want to connect it to your Young Leader affiliation, please do keep the following things in mind. First, although you're not an official spokesperson or staff of the organization, you are a Women Deliver Young Leader. And upon completion of the program, you will be a Women Deliver Young Leader alumni. Sometimes we do hear young leaders confuse titles and say they are a fellow or mistakenly say they are staff, but please remember that your title in reference to Women Deliver is Young Leader. That way you're able to accurately define yourself to your audience. Second, since you're connected to Women Deliver, we wanted to share our boilerplate or standard language on how to describe the organization when speaking to media, if that should come up. So we say, Women Deliver is a leading global advocate that champions gender equality and the health and rights of girls and women. You can also take a look at our website for additional language if that's helpful. And the last tip here would be, it's always a great idea to keep your headshot and maybe a couple images of your work in action handy in your inbox or on your computer. Some journalists will ask for images and want to better understand what it is you do. So it's great to have these at the ready.
Great, thank you, Olivia. So time for another quick poll. Are you on Twitter? Please take a minute to select an option on your screen. Great. Well, it seems like there's a good divided, decent amount of you are on Twitter, um, and then still a significant group that isn't. So journalists in many parts of the world use Twitter to follow developments, breaking news, and to mine for stories. If you aren't already on Twitter, you may want to consider your presence there because it's a good platform to curate your expertise and be part of conversations where many journalists are searching for stories and sources to speak to. In my reporting days, I often followed developments on Twitter and found people who were either directly tied to or impacted by a news event or were experts with opinions and analysis. Twitter was a great place for me to connect with these experts.
Thanks, Sumit, for that bonus tip. All right, pro tip number 4, hone your message. Whether it's for a media interview in a TV studio or a phone interview for a newspaper or digital outlet, or even preparing remarks for an event where you will be speaking, one of the most important foundations for your advocacy is honing your key message. So what is it that you want to share with the world or your audience? Let's quickly unpack what a key message is. So a key message is a well-defined message that has 2 components. First, it is simple, direct, and concise. And secondly, it defines the issue in your own terms and in your own words. So this is really the one message you want your audience to walk away with at the end of your event or your interview. We suggest keeping it to one core key message with a few key message points supporting it. That way, your message or your call to action comes through loud and clear to your audience. So let's see an example of that in action. In this video, we will watch Young Leader alumni from the class of 2018, Natasha Mwanza, share her key message advocating for young people at the decision-making table at a WD Live recording at the Women Deliver 2019 conference. All right, so let's take a look.
With us, but I wanted to introduce Natasha. Before I ask you a question, Natasha, I wanted for us to reflect, and for all of those, of course, viewing this clip, to be able to see what Natasha did on stage when she was sitting with heads of state. Here's Natasha at yesterday's opening plenary.
I'm just going to go right into it. Can I stand? I feel more powerful when I stand. I'm so sorry. Yeah, so key message is really that I have for every leader that's out here today. Do not do anything without us, for us, because one, we need young people in key positions of power. There is no way that you can be making decisions like she mentioned about young people's health, young people's education, young people's this, and then all you do is just let them be beneficiaries. We're not going to be beneficiaries. That's not happening anymore. It's 2019. So
and she went on to say some other things which may be considered disrespectful, but I'm very proud of you. You're a powerful young woman. What was it that you wanted, the key message that you wanted to deliver to the world leaders that you shared the stage with yesterday?
Well, the key message really, when I began the session, the moderator asked me, do you feel powerful? And I think one of the key messages I really wanted to bring out is, firstly, power is relative. And then secondly, I wanted to show people that young people are powerful and we're able to influence and make decisions on our own. I mean, that's an 18-year-old you just saw on the screen. I'm an 18-year-old. And the fact that I could be able to do that and drive change and speak and articulate whatever issues that I have just proves to the world that young people are capable.
Wow, I mean, what a powerful key message and a great example. Sumit, over to you.
Thank you, Olivia. So the next section will help us get some tips on how to handle your interview itself. So pro tip number 5, review the rules of engagement. Before you even begin your interview, it's essential to be mindful of the rules. Here are some key terms to be aware of that may come up. On the record. This is a journalist's strong preference at all times. Speakers can be named speaking the words they spoke. If no rules are set in advance, the assumption is that everything else is on the record. Comments that you make, eye rolls that you may make, and whatever else transpires during an interview, that means this can all be part of the record of your interview. Anything that you say during the interview can be used and attributed to you by name and job title. So unless you specify otherwise and explicitly gain the prior agreement of a reporter, assume that everything you say will be on the record. This means, just to be clear, that you can get quoted for what you've shared, published, or broadcasted. Next is off the record, which means nothing from the conversation that you had with the journalist can be used for publication. Off the record can mean different things to different people and can sometimes create confusion. Good journalism, in my experience, aims to tell the truth and report information that can be verified by a trusted source. So it isn't ideal in journalism to rely on unnamed sources or to put forward unverified information. And often journalists don't want information from someone who isn't willing to back it up with their name. Sometimes for sensitive stories, journalists are willing to bend these rules, especially where the source's security can be at risk. And then there's also on background, which is essentially information that can be provided by a source, which can be used, but the source can't be named. So if you share something with me, I could use that to inform my reporting, but I cannot attribute it to you. But in my opinion, the conventional wisdom is play it safe. Assume nothing is off the record. This way there won't be any misunderstandings. And if you are in any way in any kind of risk, especially in some countries where some of these topics may be more sensitive, you just want to be a little more careful. So unless there's a great deal of trust built with the relationship, I would just say please proceed with caution. And over to pro tip number 6. Feel in control of your conversation. So in this pro tip, I'm going to walk you through about 3 techniques to help you stay on message. The first one is bridging. So if we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So bridging essentially is moving a conversation to the point you want to make. Use this technique to answer a question and then promptly shift or bridge in the direction you want to relay your key message. So just some examples to make it a little more clear about what is bridging. So if someone asks you a question and you want to bring it back, you can answer their question and say, yes, blah, blah, blah. In addition to that, and then you can go into your key message. So if that's not clear, let's just go through a couple more examples. It could be someone asks you a question and you briefly answer it. And then you bring it back by saying, and what I can tell you is ... And that's the bridge. So it's just a technique to really bridge things back to your key message, noting that in a TV studio interview or radio interview, time will often be very limited. You may have 1 minute, maybe 1 minute and 30 seconds to give an interview sometimes. So time is so precious that you don't want the journalist to really take control of the conversation. You also want to have some control over what you'll be relaying. So just to give you another example, a journalist asks a question, you can say no, or yes, or whatever the answer is. And then you can say, but I also want to share. So these are all just a few techniques to just bring it back to your key message, known as bridging. And sometimes you may be stuck if we could go back to the previous slide. Just one more example that I think would be helpful is sometimes you may get a question. I know I've had this situation where sometimes you get a question from left field. You don't know how to answer it. You may not feel knowledgeable. You may feel it's a trick question. And one technique is to say, I can't really speak to that, but I do know. And then you bring it back to your key message. So hopefully we'll be sharing this deck with you, but these are just some quick sort of techniques that you could keep in your back pocket. And this is just one technique called bridging. The next one is called hooking. So hooking is a technique that aims to shift the conversation deeper into the issue or key message by creating curiosity. So what do I mean by that? So you may be giving an interview and you end your message with a line that has the potential to prompt a follow-up. Hooking can help you generate more space for discussion on what you want to get across to your audience. It's sort of like an almost like you're teasing your audience into wanting to, or the journalist into wanting to ask you the kinds of questions you want. So just to ground this in some examples. So here's like a quick sort of example. If you're being asked a question, you can say, when you respond, you can say, that's just one of the ways we're innovating solutions for gender equality. When you say that, a journalist oftentimes will be like, well, if that's one, what are the other ones? What's another way? So just to give you another example in case it's not clear. So you can say, here's just one compelling result we're seeing in our community, but there are other fascinating findings too. If I'm a journalist, to me, a natural follow-up question will be, oh, wait, there are other fascinating findings? Wait, what are they? Please share more results. So this is just sort of like a little technique to create curiosity, hoping the journalist will take your cue around more interesting information that you haven't immediately disclosed, and they will hopefully take the bait and ask you a follow-up question. And this way you're going deeper into your issue and curating your expertise. So if your interview is just 1 minute and 30 seconds, just this follow-up question will keep it focused on your issues. And a third technique is called flagging. So flagging is really emphasizing your main points. So you use flagging techniques to emphasize or prioritize what you consider to be the most important point you want your audience to remember. So it's basically just boiling it down to the most important nugget that if there's one thing your audience leaves with, the listeners, the readers, this is it. It's called flagging. And the ways you can help people remember this is just to bring it back and create like a summary line. So examples of this include, if there's only one point you remember today, ... and you include your key message. Or when you're ending your interview, you can say, there's basically just one question we must ask ourselves, ... and you're bringing it back to your issue. So another example is, the most important point we must remember today is ... and then you're bringing it back, because one thing you may want to keep in mind is when you're giving an interview, sometimes there's a lot to share, and for someone who's listening or reading or watching your interview, they may not be able to remember everything you said in the last 2 minutes. So it's great to sometimes repeat yourself. Don't hesitate to repeat something that's very important. And oftentimes it's the end of the interview where you see you have a few seconds left, where it's great to bring in flagging. So you can just end it by saying, it boils down to blah, blah, blah. Or in the end, we can't lose sight of this. And you make it's sort of like your last case that you want to make before you part ways with the journalist, before you part ways with the reader or your audience, or the people who are watching the news. It's really your last shot. So you can repeat yourself, but say what's the most important thing. Ultimately, the heart of the matter is, or I can't underscore enough. Fact is. So these are all just some techniques to keep in your back pocket around flagging. Over to you, Olivia.
Thanks, Sumit, for those incredible tips. So on to pro tip number 7. Say what? Give a winning soundbite. As we talked about with the key messages, it is so important to use simple, clear language, free of jargon, to keep things conversational. Jargon can be your worst enemy in interviews, in written communication, or at speaking engagements, because it can also create an issue of accessibility, because jargon makes it harder for people who aren't experts in your field to understand your work. And if they can't understand your work or its importance in human or layman's terms, then they may have trouble connecting to your work. Using clear, concise, and simple language can also help share your message on social media, so journalists or audience members can tweet out a strong quote or pull the quote for their story. And we'll talk a little bit more about social media promotion later on in the presentation. So let's check out a couple of examples. The first is girls' education champion Malala in an interview with Ellen DeGeneres. Let's watch. Belinda, we are not able to hear the audio actually. So I think we can share this link around after, and you all can take a look yourselves, and we'll share the PowerPoint as well. But it was just a very powerful soundbite from Malala, where she spoke very clearly and powerfully. You could feel her emotions, and it was really a great example of how a soundbite or a quote is an opportunity to relay a powerful message packaged with a bow. It was an opportunity to be witty or funny or even emotional, really depending on what you want to convey or what your key message is. Journalists are looking for these powerful lines that they can make for a strong quote for print or a soundbite on TV or radio. So on the right hand of your screen on the slide, you'll see another example from Young Leader alumni Aditi Sharma from the class of 2016 of Nepal in an article published by The Lily. Her quote was so powerful, it also became the media's choice for their tweet. Over to you, Sumit.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia, and apologies everyone for some of the technical challenges, but rest assured that we will share this deck with you and you'll be able to click on the links and it will work for you. So apologies for any confusion from our end. Pro tip number 8, always bring it back to the issues. So just as Olivia shared, that jargon makes it really hard to connect with work. So do granular details and getting lost in the weeds. There's that common expression in the English language that you cannot see the forest from the trees, meaning that someone can't see the big picture because they focus too much on the details. It would be like someone needing to paint an entire house in one day, but they spend half the day on picking out the right color. So just remember, it's all about the fine balance of not getting too lost in the details and bringing it back to the issues. So remember, journalists aren't always experts on your topics, and neither are their readers. You want to convince as many people as possible who are watching you on TV, reading your words in a paper, or hearing you on radio to be able to easily understand your message and what you're advocating for. For this reason, always bring it back to the human issues. So for example, if the interview is about granular law, a granular piece of legislation, say for example, on gender parity in parliament, frame your message around the issue, which in this case would be about women's leadership. Find ways to connect your message to the human element and find ways to make it about people. People connect to people, humanize the issue, share stories that could be really powerful and help people connect better to your issues and really get hooked into and passionate about what it is that you're advocating for. Back to you, Olivia.
Thanks so much, Sumit. So for our last couple of tips, we will go over some things you can do after an interview to better position yourself. Next slide, please. Great. So pro tip number 9, ride the wave. We now know that media opportunities help carry your message. But as Sumit shared earlier, in the era of social media, you can further amplify your messages through platforms like Twitter and Facebook. So be sure to promote your media spotlight on your own social media platforms. Doing so will also ensure more people see your message and can help establish you as an expert and a go-to source for other journalists. Also remember to tag @YouthDeliver on Twitter in your media spotlights so we can help amplify through Women Delivers channels as we're able to. And don't forget your Young Leader update form. This really is the best way for Women Deliver to know about your recent work so we can better pitch you to journalists for stories and match you for media and speakers bureau requests that we receive. So you'll see an example of this in play on the right. Young Leader alumni from the class of 2016, Tanzila from Pakistan, was published in the media. Then she shared this with us in her update form or over email. Then we shared it with our audience from Youth Deliver, and then she retweeted our post about her, which created a cycle of amplification and reached a much wider audience. Sumit, over to you.
Thank you so much, Olivia. What a great point around the cycles of amplification. Pro tip number 10, keep in touch. So after your interview, thank the journalists and ask them to remain in touch. These connections that you forge with journalists, even through one interview, can lead to future media opportunities. Once with one interview and you do a good job, you really establish yourself as an expert. So periodically feel free to share updates with the journalists about your issues, especially insider details that they may not know about, interesting tidbits, key developments that are happening around your work, especially if they follow your issues, if they write on your beat meaning if they write on your topics. Feel free to engage with them on social media. But with that said, I would just say keep the art of professionalism in mind. And keep that balance in mind. You don't want to email journalists too much. They're busy people. So just keep that fine balance of not emailing too often. You want to use anytime you reach out to journalists strategically. And don't add them as friends on Facebook. That would just be one tip I would share personally, because I think Facebook is one of those platforms that lends itself for gray areas. It's personal. It's not really a professional platform. So I would just suggest keeping yourself focused by choosing the right social media platforms to connect with them. So maybe think about LinkedIn instead, which is a lot more professional. Twitter, of course, because as we said earlier during the poll, that Twitter is a place where journalists are. So to me, there's like less of a personal sharing over there. So Twitter is another great place to connect. Facebook, I would say the one exception if you do connect with journalists is sometimes journalists have public pages on Facebook where you can follow them. So I think that's fine. But whereas adding them as friends, I think crosses into a new boundary. And likewise, you want to respect your own boundaries. So I don't think you want to have a journalist following your Christmas family album or updates about your dogs, as much as we all love dogs. So just keep that professionalism in mind and that fine balance to reach out to journalists at key moments when it's advantageous to your advocacy. So I hope these tips can help just provide some window into just better professional ways to stay in touch with journalists. Great. So that pretty much wraps up our three main sections, but now we have to put the knowledge to the use. And it's time for an interview. So Olivia, I just wanted to check in with you. Are we good to move forward with the interview at this time?
I think so. I'm going to try to keep all 10 tips in mind.
Great. Okay, so time for Olivia to go in the hot seat. From here forward, I will sort of pretend, because I am a journalist from a past life, but I'll be the journalist. Olivia will be the person being interviewed. And from here on, we will get started with our mock interview. So let's get started. Hi, Olivia. Sumit here. I work with CNN International in New York. I recently learned about your work with the Women Deliver Young Leaders program and wanted to learn more for a story we're doing reflecting back on 2020 and young people's efforts during this year.
Hi, Sumit. Thanks so much for having me today. Excited to be here and talk to you about my work with the Young Leaders program and these incredible young advocates. Sumit, can you tell me a little bit more about the deadline and if this interview will be on the record?
Great, Olivia. Thanks for asking. My deadline is actually the end of the week. I'm sorry, I know that's not a lot of time. And yes, this interview will be on the record. Do you feel comfortable with that?
So young leaders, before I responded to Sumit, I did a quick Twitter and Google search, and it seems like he has a lengthy record of credible reporting. So I feel comfortable moving forward with the opportunity. Also, noting his deadline, I was sure to get back to him quickly. Yes, Sumit, I am comfortable with moving forward with the interview. Thank you so much for sharing the deadline and the terms of engagement.
Great, Olivia. Let's get started with our interview then. 2020 has been a big year. COVID, climate change, demonstrations for racial justice. Young people have been at the forefront of so much. Could you please share your name and what is it that you do to support young people?
Thank you, Sumit. My name is Olivia Ades-Lawlor, and I'm an associate on the youth engagement team at Women Deliver. My team is responsible for managing the Young Leaders program and advocating for meaningful youth engagement. Personally, I run our Speakers Bureau program, where I help connect young leaders to high-level speaking engagements and advisory roles and more, which helps amplify their voices for gender equality. You're absolutely right, Sumit. 2020 has been quite the year, with young people leading the way.
Olivia, there are also some who would label young people as apathetic, lazy, and call them the me generation. What would you say to that?
Well, Sumit, I couldn't disagree more. Young people are powerful change makers. Just look at some of the most iconic people changing the world today. We see Malala advancing girls' education, Greta taking on climate change, and Lou Jane, who's been jailed for advancing women's rights in Saudi Arabia. Young people are taking on some of the biggest problems of our time and showing that they are anything but lazy and apathetic.
But many would say young people just lack the experience to lead solutions to the global complex problems we face.
Well, I'd say that having worked with about 1,000 young advocates in the Young Leaders program, I've seen firsthand how young people actually hold the key to solving these complex problems.
Olivia, but haven't young people also shown that they can get caught up in things like extremism and violence and add to our societal problems?
Well, Sumit, getting caught up in extremism and violence is not an issue exclusive to young people. If there's anything we've learned this year, whether looking at the COVID-19 pandemic, the movement for Black Lives, or much more, It's actually millions of young people who are mobilizing for a peaceful, healthier, and more just world.
Oh, that's interesting. How are young people leading on COVID?
Around the world, young people, including Women Deliver young leaders, have been leading the way in COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, from advocating in local governments to launching new testing sites in their communities.
This is quite inspiring. What would you say young people need today, Olivia?
Sumit, if there is one thing decision makers should know, it's that young people are experts in their own lives, and they know best what solutions work in their local context. Ask not what we can do for them, but rather what we can do with them.
This has been really eye-opening. Thank you, Olivia. I think we have everything we need. We look forward to airing this interview on Sunday evening.
Thanks so much for your time today, Sumit. I'd love to remain in touch. Young people's leadership is such an important issue. You have my email address, but let's also connect on LinkedIn so we can continue these important conversations.
Well, great. Well, I guess let's put up a poll, I guess, to see how Olivia did. I know we were being very cheeky and keeping this interview short to get some points across, but let's all chime in and see how Olivia did in her mock interview. So if you can take a second. Olivia, it seems like the votes are coming in to get you into a studio interview right away. Yeah, no, I just wanted to recap. It seems Olivia did a really, really wonderful job. I know this was sort of like we were trying to pack a lot into just a 4-minute interview. And it's really just an exercise in helping you recap some of the things that we've learned over the last 45, 50 minutes of this webinar. But basically, I saw Olivia hit so much of what we just went over, which I think are just the basics that we need to have a strong interview. So she did her quick vetting of me to make sure I'm a reputable journalist. She immediately established questions to find out what is the journalist deadline. She identified herself properly. She used some really great techniques. So I know she noticed hooking when she dropped that little bit about COVID. It immediately made me want to ask a follow-up question about, oh, COVID, how are young people working on COVID? That was hooking. Likewise, later on in the interview, she used another one of those techniques where she basically said, if there's one thing decision makers should remember, it's that young people are experts in their own lives. That was her ending with a big key message. That's flagging right there. Likewise, when she ended the interview, she ended it on very professional terms with an invitation to follow each other on LinkedIn. And all throughout the interview, what Olivia did so wonderful is that she kept the overall tone positive. She stayed away from jargon and technical language. So us understanding her work became so much easier is because she kept the language accessible. So Olivia, great work. I know sometimes you will say, like that you haven't done a lot of media interviews before, but I think you're in great shape. And I think this just interview showed how powerful you are. And I think a lot of young leaders, I think will be able to learn from the great script that you just delivered.
Thank you, Sumit. And thanks for the encouragement to all the participants on this call. But we do know that expertise does not just sit with us. You all have such rich experiences and expertise of your own. So I'm excited to now turn to today's young leader flash experts who will share advice or a key takeaway from their experience with media. Okay, so Sola, if you're on the line, you may begin. And just to say, please do correct me if I'm mispronouncing your name. I really apologize in advance and want to make sure I'm getting it right. So Sola, if you're on the line, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here. My name is Oloruni Shola, but you can call me Shola Abe, and I live in Nigeria. My pronouns are she and her. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about young leaders who are not so familiar or who are new to, granting interviews to journalists. And I would say that email interviews is one of the best interviews for people like this, because email interviews, they help you to put your thoughts together in the best way possible. They help you to avoid embarrassing mistakes. because you are given the opportunity, to write what you can you hear me, please?
Yep, we can hear you well.
Okay. So email interviews, they help you to write your own words, to write your thoughts in your own words, and you can even you can share your thoughts with a friend to help you, go through and see whatever mistakes you make. Hi.
Go ahead. Sorry about that.
Okay. So also it's an email interview, you can never be misquoted. So in this instance, when a journalist asks for an interview, you can ask if you can grant an email interview, if email interview is fine. So with that, you can never be misquoted because the public is reading your own words. And in a case where you are misquoted, you can easily call out, the journalist or the media house because they do not fully represent what you wrote. Also, if you are to appear on radio or TV for an interview, I believe you should be able to ask the journalist if he or she can intimate you with one or two questions so that you're not caught unawares. Like I said before, my points are for people who are new to granting media interviews, or for people who have not granted one or two interviews before. And when you are granting a new interview, you are nervous, you want to be sure you're doing the right things, you want to be sure you are using the right keywords. So in this instance, if you know you're granting a TV or a radio interview, I think I believe you should be able to ask the interviewer if they can intimate you with one or two questions so that you're not caught unawares. Also, don't be in a rush to answer a question when you are asked. You can take a few seconds, to digest the question. And in a case where you don't understand what the interviewer is asking you, you can ask the interviewer to shed more light on it. You don't have to take a question, because the thing is, if you answer a question and you don't understand it, you tend not to give the audience what they want to hear. You might even speak something, or you might even put your advocacy in jeopardy, or the cause you're advocating in jeopardy. So it's important that you ask an interviewer to shed more light on the question an interviewer is asking you. Yeah. So those would be my few points for interviews.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Charlotte. That was perfect. And next we will have Anial. Is that how you pronounce your name if you're on the line?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Neil Deng. I live in Kenya. I would like to share one tips that I've experienced in my work and being on the spotlight on refugee issues. Most of the time, we often get lost in figures, and it's good we try to avoid being more general when we talk about our work. And there are two ways we can see this. The first way is by sharing what your team does. For example, if you are talking about a project you work on, you can share what your team does to make that happen. So you can take people behind the scene, look in what each person of your team contributed. That would be a good way to share your work. The second way is take people in part. When you're asked about how your project make a difference, or how the work you do make a difference, we often get lost with figures, and there's a very good quote that I would like to share about from a psychologist that I follow about a lot, that says, the more we die, the less we care. And that shape how refugee stories are being communicated, because people now look more at how you make an impact in one person's life. So when you share about the impact of your work, make it more personal. You can give an example about someone who went through your program and was able to come out of it with the expectation that he was looking for. So try to get lost in figures, try to avoid figures as much as possible, and look into making your interviews more personal. When you ask about the impact of your work, talk about what your team does, and talk about the people you impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great point on making sure what you're saying is bringing it back to the human perspective and bringing in those personal stories. Those are so strong. Thank you. Next, we will have Chuaib, if you're on the line. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shuaib Al-Hajjaji, and I live in Tunisia. My pronouns are he, him, his. And one key advice that I think is vital to your media success is how you report stories. You should always use storytelling, and you should always humanize your stories. This will enable you to bring the audience attention to important news that may seem dull and boring, and also treat controversial subjects. For example, I use storytelling when discussing queer issues in Tunisia, focusing on the individual human experience instead of reciting facts. As a result, opponents can put themselves in the shoes of the subject without prejudice or predisposed ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's such a great point. All right, we're going to hear from Liz next, if you're on the line, Liz.
Yes, I am. Thank you very much. My name is Liz Gwantai, and I live and work in Nairobi, the capital city of Kenya. My work is in promoting sustainable development and human rights in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm going to give a few tips from my experience with media interviews, and especially my interviews that I had for Women Deliver. My first tip is it's very important to request for talking points from the journalist or the person who's going to interview you, because this is going to help prepare on the responses, and you can research on the topics if the interview is on factual points. And you can also request for an interview medium that you're comfortable with. For example, you can ask the interviewer if they're okay with you recording your answers or writing them down. You can request for alternatives. If they agree, then that's okay. If they do not agree, then you can go along with what the interviewer prefers. My last point is that it's important to be very honest with your responses, and especially the interview is on the work that you are doing as a young person. Do not exaggerate your figures or do not underrate your work. Be very honest, and when asked for opinion, state it in your own words. Remember that it is on record and you can be quoted. So make sure that you're polite and give an accurate or a fair point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. Such great points. Arya, are you on the line?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Arya Manandar from Nepal, and I use the pronouns she and her. The challenge I particularly faced after I chose to publicize my selection as a Women Deliver Young Leader in media interviews and magazine features was that the message put across always seemed limited to an achievement and celebration rather than young leaders' potential, future ideas, and want of prospective partners, funding agencies, like-minded individuals in joining us propagate our respective campaign or action that we will be taking from that time onwards. So what I realized was the need to make our key messages and objective of this program clear. And in doing so, it is important to clarify other youths and partners, media persons, or agencies about the beginning of a young leaders program, or in making clear that our journey has just begun and we need their support. So also, whether it's on TV or the phone, a media interview with an emotional engagement, personal stories, sharing of ideas with relevance to the region and country is a great way to get the word out about our organization, our campaign, and about Women Deliver. So that way, other young leaders will also be able to apply and be part of this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arya. Estefania, are you online?
Yes, here. Hi, hello everyone. It's a pleasure to speak to you. My name is Estefania. I'm a journalist from Venezuela. And in my experience, as many of you have said, we often address topics that are viewed as controversial in some spaces, such as abortion and even other issues within the feminist agenda. So be ready to get undesirable questions sometimes and unwelcome attitudes from reporters sometimes. We have to be prepared to answer respectfully thought questions. Make sure you have hard data and also stories to inspire empathy over these issues. And it's also important to stay on the message, even if they want us to change the topic, because we often have short time to explain complex issues, so we have to make the most of it. And finally, it's important to keep monitoring the media, keep a list with names and contact of journalists that seems interested in covering the topics you work on. So you can reach out to them every time you need it and send them press releases and key information you want to disseminate. And yes, I think mapping the media lives is very useful.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our young leader Flash experts. We heard such strong and insightful tips from taking time to answer your question. We heard a lot about ensuring you're using storytelling and personal stories to bolster your point. We heard the point about being honest, thoughtful, and respectful with your responses, especially around sensitive topics, and ensuring you are staying on message if journalists try and divert the conversation. So I think a lot of these really mimic some of the 10 tips that Sumit and I went through. But thank you all to those young leaders, and over to you, Sumit, for some Q&A.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia, and especially thank you to the amazing young leader Flash experts. Those were some amazing tips, and it just, to me, goes to show that so many of you have expertise as well, and that we're really a network here, that it's not just the Women Deliver Youth Engagement team, that other young leaders have so much to share. And I hope other young leaders, you all have different strengths and areas that you want to grow in, but just know this network is so rich of young leaders and alumni that you can learn from each other. I think today is just such a prime example to just see how if you're ever stuck in a situation where you don't know how you can handle an interview, or even if it's not related to media, just how other young leaders can support you all within this body, within this network, have so much shared expertise. And I hope you'll work, whether it's through Mighty Networks or once hopefully COVID is over and there are opportunities to connect in person, for you all to be able to rely on each other for that support network. And I just wanted to I'm still getting over just these, I wrote down all these tips. Shola, your tip around, especially if you are not the most seasoned expert and you're a little nervous about doing media interviews in the beginning, that starting out with email interviews is best. So when you get an opportunity, see if you can send the responses written via email. That's amazing. This way you can correct yourself as you're writing something. Neil, your point around let's not get lost in the figures, that was so important, because sometimes we as experts want to put out so many stats and we get lost in that. So it's all about like bringing it back to the issues. Shuaib, what an amazing point around storytelling, that we want to humanize the issues and the individual human experience. And I noticed that Ahmed has a question in the chat box around how to deal with opposition. We can get more into that, but Shoaib's tip really speaks to that, is when you start humanizing issues and you add empathy and talk about the human experience, it becomes harder for people who oppose you to argue points, especially when you're promoting gender equality or LGBT rights. When you ground it in the human experience, how do they actually, it becomes hard for them to counter that. Liz, your points around preparation, choosing the mediums and alternatives, and of course, being honest in your responses, because your credibility is everything. So that was such an important tip. And Arya, great points about, as young leaders, I know the outside world sees many of you as accomplished advocates, but we also want to balance that, of course, with noting that many of you are at the start of your journey and that you need support. So making sure that while you curate your wins, your achievements, we also want to make the case for young advocates like yourself, so we can continue getting more support for you, and that people can invest in young people's leadership. And Estefania, like such an amazing experience that you come from in Venezuela, and just so many great points that you shared about balancing data with stories that create empathy, and being able to be ready if you get undesirable questions. So just, yeah, once again, Olivia and I are both just so completely floored by just the expertise all of you shared so quickly in 2 minutes for each of you. But now I want to hand it over to other young leaders who may have questions. And I'm hoping the remainder of our time can be spent on discussions, questions. It could be a place where I also welcome our Flash experts or young leaders who perhaps weren't Flash experts, who have expertise here. Happy for Olivia, myself, all of us to chime in and help each other answer questions, or if there's anything that was confusing. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, and our producers will help us go through these questions.
Great, thanks, Sumit. So I see we have one question or two questions already in the chat box. Noju, do you want to start off? Are you on the line? Or anyone who had a question, feel free to pop off mute and go ahead.
Hello, I'm here. I'm sorry, I was on mute.
No worries, go ahead.
So yeah, I just wanted to ask you guys, I mean, to have like a mock interview or just to how explain us how we can like address some sensitive issues, as you mentioned, like for example, the LGBTQ rights or the sexual and reproductive health and rights in such developing countries are like taboo subject, you know. But like we want to educate people on these subjects, and but like how can we do that? How can we deal with the media? I mean, I wanted to know what are your tips. Thank you.
Great. I think that's a really good question. I think especially in places where the media landscape is more challenging, and especially on a topic that could be sensitive, like LGBTI rights in some countries. So I think one key thing is when when you're looking for media interviews, or if you're getting one, I think one of the first things I would recommend is find people who are friendly to your issues. I think in each context, doing a mapping of who are the media players. Is there any one outlet or a journalist who is sympathetic to your issues? And I think establishing a relationship with them is maybe the first place, is because together with them, because you know there's some trust earned, they're perhaps on the same page on the issues. Um, and maybe their mindset is also one around creating awareness to break these taboos. I would say the first step is probably doing a mapping to see what are the media outlets, are there any friendly ones? And within those friendly ones, are there any friendly journalists? If you don't know where to start, I would say, I think, first of all, I think most advocates do know because you're consuming news yourself. So you know who is reporting on your issues, who's doing it better, who's not doing it well. So that's one place to start. But I think more than that, you can do some deep dive research. I would also encourage you to perhaps, if there are opportunities around webinars or post-COVID, one day being able to go to networking opportunities. This way you can meet people and get a sense for yourself who is friendly. But I would say that's maybe one first step to do, is get a lay of the land and do a landscape analysis of media. And I would welcome if other young leaders have any advice on this front from your own experiences, or Olivia, by all means. The expertise isn't just with me, it's with so many here. So I would welcome others to also help support this question.
Thanks, Sumit. And I know that Estefania had a great recommendation in her flash talk about remaining respectful and on message. And so I think that comes back to really doing your homework and preparing those key messages and your key points that you can continue to come back to and point to if you're feeling like you're backed against a wall, and using techniques like Sumit went over, like hooking, bridging, and flagging to really bring it back to your key messages. But I welcome young leaders to pop in and see if they have other tips for this question. Okay, if there are no one else who wants to come off mute and respond, we can move on to the next question. I see Ahmad, do you have a question? Perhaps they're not on the line. Okay, well then others who have questions, feel free to just go right ahead. Either type them in and we can read them, or feel free to go off mute and read them out yourself. Okay, no questions. I guess we did a great job. Oh, here we go. We have one. How would you deal with an interviewer asking you to comment on the religious opposition to your initiative? Sumit, you want to take that?
Sure. So how would you deal with an interviewer asking you to comment on religious opposition to your initiative? Let me So here's one technique I'm going to do. I'm going to pause, as one of the young leader flash experts said. You don't need to rush to answer a question. So I'm doing it right here. I'm pausing for a minute to collect my thoughts. I've been put on the spot. I don't have every answer polished, but I'm going to pause for a second and just reflect on this question to give a good answer. So I think one technique, and I think this was shared by the young leader, so credit where it's due, is the aspect of empathy. I think when you speak about things in human terms, when you talk about, say, if you use an example of something like, let's stay with the example of LGBTI rights. I know in some contexts there might be religious opposition to promoting LGBTI rights, but when you ground it and sort of anticipate, like, I think sometimes using their own language, so talking about like I think, like, if I were in that position, I would use things like morally, like we're taught in religion that love thy neighbor. So even framing arguments in their own language, I think, is one technique you can keep in mind. But the other is, as I was saying, empathy. Of people cannot argue with empathy. Like, when you learn to treat each other, and I think so much of our rights-based framework is around the dignity of one another. So when you talk about things in that context, when you outline the harm that is directly caused to people, and you insert that human element, I think it becomes very difficult for people to argue or to uphold that opposition, to say, oh yes, it if you talk about how a trans community in a certain country is facing violence, and you talk about, like, just their struggles, I think it becomes very hard for the opposition to then say, yes, I totally support continued persecution of this community. So I think, once again, tying it in with the empathy, but arming yourself also with data, because it becomes hard to argue between not just the human element and emotions, but also to argue credible data. And I think that's what's so important, is having that evidence base. And Women Deliver often prides itself on being an evidence-based organization. So having that balance of stories that are powerful coupled with strong facts and strong data, that becomes really hard to argue. And I think whether you're religious opposition, political opposition, it gets really tough. Does that help answer part of that question? And I'd welcome if young leaders have more points to share on this front. You all, many of you do live in challenging landscapes, so I'd welcome, like, if any of you have tips, please do jump in.
Can I jump in, please?
Absolutely.
I think it is, for me, has been useful to keep, like, the speech grounded in human rights. Like, this is not something, even sometimes feminists, I try to avoid feminism, the tag feminism in some interviews that I know are, that I know I'm gonna find opposition. So I keep my speech grounded in human rights, and it's something that everyone can agree on. And also everyone has the right to have a religion. We also have the right to have a dignified life, and I don't know, so many topics that are grounded in these facts that are difficult to are difficult to find opposition to that. So keep your speech always grounded in human rights, and it's something that people can deny.
Such a great point. Thank you both. Let's move on to the next question. Ishanvi, do you want to go off mute and ask your question? Otherwise, I can go ahead and read it. Okay. I will read it out loud. Is it all right to send a press package out to reporters to get your work known, or should you traditionally wait for the reporter to reach out first?
So I think this is a really great question, Ishanvi. I think it speaks to me, just your strategy I think sending out a press package is, to me, being proactive rather than reactive. To me, media opportunities don't just fall on people's laps. It requires so much homework. It requires relationship building. And I think if you've done that and you've established some good relationships, sending out a press package can be a great way to get information out to reporters. But just be aware that for some journalists, their inbox, I'm just thinking back to even my CNN days. I kid you not, I think there would be within 1 hour 100 emails, and there would often be press packages for reporters. And I think when you're in the business of breaking news and you have to file, your work is constantly urgent. I think email gets harder, and I think that's where, while a press package I think can be a very good thing, I think the foundation that one needs to lay is starting to create a relationship with journalists. So whether you're at events, webinars, make it a point to connect with journalists and create that symbiotic relationship where they see you, where it's a benefit to you both, where they need you because they know you'll be a credible person, an expert to speak to around the interview they're doing. So they need you. And likewise, you need them to advance your advocacy and reach a broader audience. So once you create that symbiotic win-win relationship, journalists will constantly want to reach out to, but I think the homework for all of us is building those relationships, and that takes time. So I'm thinking back when I was a researcher at the Committee to Protect Journalists. Someone actually connected me to a Voice of America reporter, and it was my first interview with them. I gave a radio interview, and before I knew it, I think even though it was just maybe a 30-second interview for just a comment to an attack that had happened in a certain country against a journalist, that journalist, radio reporter, whenever there would be a future attack in her region where she reported, she just dialed my number, like always. I became her go-to expert. And that spoke to, like, one opportunity led to us creating a relationship with each other. So sometimes when she didn't know about things, I would send her that information. And so it became this symbiotic relationship where we both supported each other's work. And so press packages, I think, speak to that. Is they can help start relationships. They can help keep in touch around key developments. But I think the key thing I would like to have you focus on is find ways to engage with journalists on Twitter, build relationships in person or virtually in this environment. And I think then press packages become even more helpful.
Thank you so much, Sumit. That's a great response. Do any other young leaders want to come off mute and respond to that question? All right, then let's move on to our next question in the chat from Esmat. Esmat, do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Esmat, pronounced as she, her. So the question is, if you were sitting with an interviewer and then he suddenly asked you something very personal, but you rather not like to answer it, but then he pops again and asks the same question, and he's like trying to push you in the corner, as they say. And what can we do or act in such situation?
I think that's a really, really great question, and I think is bound to at some point happen. Journalists are nosy by nature. They're very curious, and sometimes will bring it onto personal matters. So I have an answer on this, but I'm going to pause. I'm going to first see if any of our Flash experts or other young leaders want to take a stab at this question first, and then I'm happy to come back and offer something. So Flash experts, other young leaders, would you like to take an attempt at this?
Hello. Shoaib here. I think you can just politely decline to answer the question, and you don't have to explain yourself. As a journalist, this happened to me in the past, and sometimes because you are, as you said, curious by nature, you want to ask more and discover more, but sometimes you enter like space, and it's not. You're not entitled to know that information, so you can just decline. That's it.
That's great. Anyone else?
Sumit, I think there might have been a technique you went over that would directly correlate to this question.
Good point, Olivia. So one technique that I think comes into great play here is your technique around when we were talking about bridging. You can shift away and say, yes, I see your question, but I think today I'd like to focus the conversation instead on. That's one line you can keep up your sleeve. You can also say things like, and I think it's okay to, I think as Shoaib said earlier, like you can politely but directly decline. You can say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm like, today I'd like to focus on XYZ issue. We have precious time together. Let's focus on the topic at hand. I don't think getting into some of these personal matters will be helpful to you or to me. So just be diplomatic, but feel free to be in control of your conversation. You have expertise, you have knowledge, you're there to share that. You're not there to get into personal matters. That's not what the interview is about. And saying that politely and respectfully, I would hope journalists will get it. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes journalists, just for all of us to be aware, sometimes some journalists don't respect boundaries. Oftentimes many do, some may not, and it's okay to repeat yourself. It's okay to use some of these techniques. And if you find it's not working, just remember, don't be afraid to be direct. But always try to be respectful, but be direct. And for the future, if you find they are continuing to make you uncomfortable, I would you can actually say, I'd love to, we're running short on time now. I'd love to end the interview. So feel like you can, don't feel like the journalist is always in control of the conversation. Feel you are powerful advocates. Don't let your power, don't lose sight of your own power. So just remember your boundaries and remind them to others as well.
Thanks, Sumit. And I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. But Nina had a great question that is a good segue from the last one. Nina, do you want to read it out loud or do you want me to read it?
I can read it out loud. Thank you, Olivia. So my question is, what do you do if you feel like you haven't expressed yourself clearly after an interview has ended? If you realize, oh no, I forgot to mention this, or you realize you didn't really express yourself the way you wanted, or after an interview, if you find that the journalist didn't really capture your message or your words clearly after it's been released publicly?
Nina, that's such a good question, and definitely it's a situation I've been in before. But before I answer, I want to turn it over to once again our flash experts or other young leaders, if anyone has wants to take a stab at this through your experiences, and then I'm happy to chime in after.
I think we should ask the journals to cancel that. I mean, the blog or the article that you posted about us. I mean, we will try our best to do that. I think that's my opinion.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, no
I
worries.
think
So,
you always
oh,
have
I'm
the
so
right
sorry.
to. I think if you are, if you feel like you were misleading or you were cited wrongly, you always have the right to ask for a rectification.
Great point. Absolutely. So I would say definitely if you feel like what you shared was not reflected properly, was not the record, I think it's very important to move to contact the journalists and ask for a correction. If this is like in a print paper or even online, for them to find some way to correct the record. Oftentimes, even radio interviews and TV interviews end up on online pieces. So there is space for correction. So exploring with them how they can correct the record. I think another thing I would just recommend is I think you have a little more flexibility when it comes to a print or online piece because whereas a live interview, it's already happened, so it becomes difficult to go back. If you wanted to add something, you can, and that's why I would say any interviews for broadcast, if you're doing a live radio interview that's being recorded or a TV interview that's being recorded, that's why preparation is so important. So just as someone said earlier, one of the flash experts, that having your talking points ready, I think it was Liz who said this, who did a lot of interviews during the Young Leader class of 2020 announcement, is having your talking points ready. This way you feel like, treat them as check boxes of you've hit all your points. And that's why your preparation work is so important. But inadvertently, there may be times where you left out a point. And that's where I think if it's not a live interview, you have a little more freedom. So you can go back to the journalist and just say, our conversation in the limited time, I forgot to mention a really important piece. Here's one thing, XYZ. I think this would be really, really important to reflect in the record as well. And I think you can make an attempt that way. But with live interviews, it just gets a little trickier. But yes, always look at what's been published about you. And if it wasn't accurate, do reach out to the journalist and clarify to them that this is not what I had expressed. Is there some way you can update this or update my quote online or things like that?
Thanks, Sumit, and thanks for that great question, Nina. Are there any last questions before we move on to our last section?
I have a question.
Go right ahead.
Yep. So I'm Jacqueline from Hong Kong, Canada. Recently, I did an interview with, not really interview, but it was like a panel with UN Women with one of their like campaigns. And you know, sometimes when we do panels, we draw from personal experiences and talk about, because we're all gender advocates who start advocacy works based on personal experience or personal observations. And I find that even combined with like the most theoretical like knowledge that you can find on the most like academic research, and you weave it in the most kind of like diplomatic ways, it still kind of strikes a chord when it's still kind of sensitive to yourself. So that's just that's a question I want to ask the young leader team, like the youth engagement team, on how to handle those insecurities when you actually publicize or self-promote in a way. Do you get what I mean here?
Would you say a little bit more about your question specifically? I think I'm understanding the context, but want to be sure I'm understanding your question correctly.
I guess how to handle, like, so you have a message that can be perceived like that, like people can just like get without knowing the context or where it came from. Like you can just put out a message like that. Like for example, like let's see, like FGM, like that may be very personal to a lot of people. But you can just put the message out there saying FGM is freaking illegal. But I'm just kind of wondering, I'm also asking on behalf of a lot of our young leaders who may be very new to the scene, on how to personally deal with those insecurities of like, oh, what if they find out, like what, like it just feels like it's like a personal piece that's being put out there in the media and being broadcasted, right? So very often that may feel very naked. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to ask the youth engagement team on like how to deal with those emotions, and also how to make that fine balance between advocacy and also just other things.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. I think from my perspective, it's really important that you're comfortable with what you're sharing. You should never share anything that you don't feel comfortable sharing or that you don't want to share publicly. It's really, you're in control of the conversation and your own narrative, and you shouldn't share anything that you don't want to put out there. And I think it comes back to really doing your homework and working on those key messages to make sure that you have your own talking points that you do feel comfortable sharing, and you're able to drive your own point home and your own advocacy messages without putting yourself at risk or without exposing things that you don't want to share publicly. And doing that preparation, I think, can just put you in a position where you feel in control of your own narrative and in control of your panel. So you're only sharing what you want to share specifically, and no one's making you feel otherwise. But I'm also happy to answer any other questions via email or have a quick phone call with anyone. I see we only have a couple of minutes, but just quickly, is there anyone else that would like to respond to Jackie's question?
Yeah. Hello?
Oh, yeah. Yep, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Okay. Personally, I think as advocates for like human rights and social justice and all of that, we put ourselves at risk, but I think we should take well-calculated risks. It should be some, that you're taking a risk, but you're really making a change at the same time. You're not just putting yourself in a very vulnerable position without bringing any positive change. So I think if you're taking a risk and you're exposing yourself, in my own experience, it's always okay, but what are the drawbacks? What are the positive effects that are going to happen? And am I actually advancing an agenda? Am I actually helping a minority and all of that? So yeah, so you should you should take very well calculated risks. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Shoaib. All right. If there are any other questions, please feel free to email info@, and we will share this presentation with you all so you can have this in your pocket. But just really quickly, we're going to go on to the post questions. So these are the same questions that you saw at the beginning, and they're really just to gauge knowledge learned during this training. And so no right or wrong, no pressure kind of getting all the answers right, but just fill these out to the best of your abilities and take a couple seconds. So I'm going to launch them right now, and thank you for responding. All right, take a couple more seconds. We really appreciate you completing these so our team has a sense of how people learn during this training and how we can change it and improve it for next time. So thank you all in advance. All right. Sumit, I'll let you close us up now.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Olivia, and thanks everyone for taking out the time to join us today. We know each of you comes at media skills with different levels of expertise and experience. We hope everyone who joined today can leave this training with at least one helpful takeaway. We know that there's so much to share when it comes to media and communications, and sometimes just not enough time, but we hope this focused training gives you all that baseline when it comes to media interviews and sets you up for future success. Thanks again to today's Flash presenters. I'm still overwhelmed by all the great advice you all shared, and to our producers, Belinda and Nina, for all the background work that went into making and creating this webinar. And most of all, thank you, Olivia, for being my partner today and making this a richer training so young leaders could learn from your expertise as well. Wishing you all the best. Know we are available in the future if you have a media interview or a speakers bureau session coming up. Email info@, and our team will best try to support you as possible. And stay tuned in the months ahead for other learning opportunities and for continued dialogue. Thank you, everyone.